Human trafficking, that is a process by which someone is placed into the situation of slavery, diminished greatly in the 19th century and almost completely disappeared in the 20th century in Iraq. The 2003 war, however, shook the fabric of the Iraqi society, wiping away a great deal of the rule of law and infrastructure. Now, 9 years after the war, is human trafficking once again a major problem in Iraq?
One of the results of this war was a full army of devastated young women who were sold as commodities and whose lives had been destroyed.
That was Yanar Mohammed, the head of the Organization for Women's Freedom in Iraq, also known as OFI.
In a Middle Eastern society, once you've been prostituted, there's almost no way that you could blend into the mainstream society anymore. The women of Iraq may not be better off under this occupation because authorities or the forces of occupation did not think it was their responsibility to even care for the issue.
OFI, which was established in 2003 in Baghdad, works with and offers shelter to Iraqi women and girls who have been exploited for labor and sex, both nationally and internationally. Mohammed believes that human trafficking is one of the many side effects of the 2003 war that civilians have had to endure, since human trafficking was not at all apparent during the Ba'ath regime.
We would never hear of an issue of trafficking. We didn't even know what the word meant. This was before the war on Iraq, but after the war, new authorities came into place and some measures began to take place without having any drafted law that supported them.
Mohammed says the new authorities were mostly fundamentalist religious groups who were in control of the Ministry of Interior, including police and intelligence.
Some of those groups or individuals, they acted like self-acclaimed vigilantes who would go around the streets and who would feel free to kill women if they suspected that they were in prostitution.
Professor Bridget Carr is the director of the Human Trafficking Clinic at the University of Michigan Law School and has been working directly with young Iraqi girls who had been trafficked within Iraq and resettled in the U.S. by the United Nations. She explains factors that could have contributed to the development of human trafficking in Iraq.
Human trafficking is prevalent worldwide, whether there is conflict, post-conflict, or no conflict. And so I think what we see in conflict and post-conflict zones are just the vulnerabilities of people are even heightened.
Carr believes that when people are vulnerable, traffickers will step in. Also, she says in conflict and post-conflict zones, law enforcement and government officials often don't have the power or authority in which to try and stop that kind of exploitation.
Trafficking in Iraq has so many commonalities with what we see happening in the United States and Mexico and other places, in that it is vulnerable people who are often on the margins of society and who are exploited for profit.
Dr. Kevin Bales, an expert on modern slavery and president of Free the Slaves, explains that human trafficking is not a new industry in conflict and post-conflict zones. Instead, it is a phenomenon that has had a long historical presence in human civilization.
The relationship between slavery and trafficking and conflict is just about the oldest set of criminal factors that come together in human history.
According to Bales, in the Tigris and Euphrates area, now in Iraq, and at the very beginning of human written records, people in conflict were often affected by slavery.
So the crucial thing here is that anytime you have conflict which causes the collapse of the rule of law, it means that people using force to take control of other people's lives. And it kind of unleashes a lawlessness and a ubiquity of force that means slavery tends to erupt almost every time there is a conflict.
Bales further explains how the collapse of the rules of law in post-war Iraq has greatly exacerbated human trafficking.
Obviously, under Saddam Hussein, the rule of law was not what you would call a perfectly straight and balanced and just rule of law, but it was a very strict rule of law.
Bale says that the strict rule of law under Hussein then prevented some human rights violations. When Hussein's regime collapsed and the rule of law disappeared, slavery and trafficking emerged.
A war that involves the destruction of infrastructure physically, but also the destruction of the kind of conceptual and juridical and policy and governmental infrastructures. And it's not surprising at that point that you begin to see criminals emerging and taking advantage of that chaos.
Although statistics released by OFI show that 50,000 Iraqi females have been trafficked since the outbreak of the war, Mohammed thinks that the actual figures are much higher. She says many kidnapping cases go unreported in Iraq due to the shame that such an incident could bring to the victims and their families.
But in my assumption, that number is very conservative. The real numbers are much more. Daughters kidnapped or who disappeared. This is one of the biggest strikes of shame that could hit an Iraqi family. So they would just tell the neighbors that she died without giving any details.
Mohammed offers a cultural explanation for this notion of shame caused by the disappearance of one's daughter.
In a Middle Eastern society, and especially in Iraq, a woman who had left her house for more than 24 hours would most probably expect to be slain when she goes back there.
Mohammed, during her years working with trafficked women and girls, observed that while trafficking is random and could happen to anyone in any Iraqi city, there have been a few common trends that emerged in post-war Iraq.
Cases that we found, either the families are very poor, family had to sell one of their daughters into something called marriage so as the rest of their children can survive, or that the girls are kidnapped and seduced by love by men who were recruited by traffickers.
Mohammed explains that trafficking of those young Iraqi girls became an industry because the consumers were asking for more and more of it.
In some of the cases, the girls were kidnapped as virgins, and we could trace a few cases that were trafficked all the way to the Arab Emirates, specifically to a very thriving market in Abu Dhabi, where they would be sold for high prices, if $10,000 is a high price for a teenage girl.
Bale talks in detail about forced marriage, a prominent cultural trend in Iraq that has been classified by the UN as a form of human trafficking.
What we're lacking when it comes to forced marriage is a really clear understanding. I mean, we can certainly point to individual cases in Iraq and other countries where we're saying, look, here's a 15-year-old girl. Someone has basically taken away all possibility of choice on her part and said she must go with this man.
Forced marriage then entails a complete control of one person on another, the family and the designated groom over the bride-to-be. If she tries to get away, violence is usually used to make her stay. According to Bales, those are the hallmarks of slavery.
The only trouble that we have in terms of understanding it is that many countries, and particularly countries in the Middle East, are very hesitant about investigating the nature of forced marriage within their culture.
Mohammed has also noticed that the orphans and widows of war have fueled the industry of human trafficking. She believes that the reason why orphans and widows are even more vulnerable to the traffic is because the Ministry of Social Affairs has not been adequately addressing their needs.
The Ministry of Social Affairs does not give much offer for the widows of the war. They would give one widow who has one child something equivalent to, say, $75 a month. That is if she has her full papers and her IDs and everything is in place and she had access to the right officials. And through our experience, we found out that most of the designated salaries of widows were going to some official's pocket.
Yanar Mohammed says that the lack of anti-trafficking laws in Iraq is causing the government to take extraordinary measures in dealing with female victims.
In 2005, we went into the prisons of women, which were open to us, and that is the Central Prison of Women Academy. We were surprised to find that even more than half the inmates in the prison were there because of either being prostituted or being trafficked across the country and caught while being trafficked.
According to Muhammad, prostitution in Iraq is illegal. Since there is no anti-trafficking law that would address this new issue, a woman who has been trafficked could be convicted of prostitution.
So we found a good number of very young women who were held under the verdict of prostitution just because she was trafficked.
Muhammad claims that despite their demand, members of her organization have not received any help from parties in question.
We were contacted by the IOM. They should be taking care of issues of trafficking. They asked for our information, and I gave them the report that we have and provided them with answers to all their questions.
Muhammad and her colleagues received no response at all, she says, other than a very negative one.
We did not hear anything from them. We did not hear anything from the U.S. government. We were bad-mouthed by the Iraqi government.
Bales predicted the weak response from the authorities in Iraq to human trafficking. This is because of the ongoing need to restore justice and rebuild the war-torn country's formal economy.
In the history of global diplomacy, human trafficking and contemporary forms of slavery take a back seat to almost any other issue. So that if you look to what countries are doing and saying, you'll see that they may talk okay about contemporary slavery, but they don't necessarily take the actions or put the resources there.
Bales says that there are many resources going into Iraq from different places devoted to many other needs. He thinks, however, that most of these resources don't actually confront the problems of slavery and trafficking.
It's a hidden crime at the best of times, and when you have a certain amount of unrest and confusion, it's even easier to hide a crime like human trafficking and contemporary slavery.
Everyone we talked with agreed that there remains much work to be done to combat human trafficking in Iraq. Professor Carr summarizes her views.
Iraq hasn't met the minimum standards for human trafficking law as laid out by the U.S. State Department. They do have a plan in place, but the legislature hasn't passed the law that that plan describes, partially because the legislature hasn't met all that much.
She believes that getting the bare minimum legal requirements in place in the Iraqi system is necessary. She also has many other ideas, including
putting forth an awareness campaign within the country, and then finally, but this is something many countries struggle with, trying to figure out the best way to identify victims and treat them as victims and not as criminals or other things, because fighting human trafficking, it takes both prevention and identification of victims.
OFI, like other NGOs, has helped dozens of survivors forget about their past, heal, and move forward. However, they cannot meet every demand, including the difficulty in addressing the victims' medical and psychological needs, their addictions, and other related effects of the traumatic experience. Visit our site in the future to listen to stories of survivors of human trafficking as told by Yanar Muhammad. For World News Radio, I'm Dina Sharhan.